WNYC-TV presents Barbara Lee Diamonstein and...
Hello, I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein. Architecture is called the inescapable art. Many of our best buildings get away from us each year. That doesn't have to happen, and that is what our two guests today, two of our most interesting municipal minds, will be talking about. I'm very pleased to introduce Kent Barwick, the chairman of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, and Hugh Hardy, a prize-winning architect and member of the firm of Hardy, Holtzman, and Pfeiffer. A very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
In the 13 years that the Landmarks Commission has been in existence, I think both the public and private attitudes about landmarks and about our city have changed considerably. Perhaps we should begin by talking a bit about how New York, meaning the city, the public sector, and how New Yorkers are changing their attitudes about squandering their patrimony. Are we becoming more caring? Is there a difference? And if so, how has it manifested itself?
Well, I think, if I may speak to that, there's an extraordinary difference. You mentioned the 12 or 13 years that the Landmarks Commission has been in business. That I think it would be fair to say when the Landmarks Commission began, when the great public outcry grew up after the loss of Penn Station and the Brokaw houses and other very significant...
Metropolitan Opera?
Actually, the Metropolitan Opera is another case. That was lost after there was a Landmarks Commission, but before the provision that protected interiors, which I know you, among others, had something to do with. But that great public outcry gave rise to the Wagner administration and really came into being the Lindsay administration, the notion that there should be a commission to designate a few of the great outstanding monuments and preserve those from what I think was imagined to be the general process of redevelopment that would surely consume the city and leave us with a city that we would hardly recognize but would somehow be better for us. And I think today looking at the physical evidence, there are some 500 individually designated structures. There are now 34 historic districts. That is,
how many buildings are there in all that would come under this
we're counting now, but we think there are somewhat just under 14,000 individual structures, most of those being in historic districts.
What is an historic district?
Historic district, the easiest way to describe it is a neighborhood where there's a continuum of either building style or a comprehensible place. Gramercy Park, Greenwich Village, Brooklyn Heights are really among the oldest historic districts, the oldest designated, but they also include districts like Soho, the cast iron district, which are made up of mercantile buildings as opposed to residential buildings, and areas that are really emerging in Brooklyn, that is to say where a great number of the houses still have yet to be renovated. And all told, there are some 34 of these districts. And what these districts represent, I think, is a feverish hunt on the part of New Yorkers, not so much for the past, but for stability. And what they found in the process of rediscovering and reusing their neighborhoods in the best traditions of the Renaissance is things that were underfoot all along, which they can now put to good use. So what I see is this really underlying this process is not so much a restoration of the past, but a much more intelligent use of the present with a rather optimistic view of the future.
It seems to me there's a lot of confusion about the use of the word landmark. To begin with, a dictionary defines it in one way. In fact, the dictionary specifically defines it as a prominent or conspicuous object on land that serves as a guide or a distinguished or prominent feature, part, or event. What do you call a landmark, Hugh?
It's not only what the dictionary says, because it's a conspicuous monument and that marks a place and marks time. It also comes from the context of the time in which it was made. And what's so extraordinary about all of these discussions of landmarks and monuments in cities is they cannot take place except in time. Cities are all about time and place. And so a landmark is special because of what's around it as much as the thing itself. And that's clearly the case in buildings that have been destroyed, not because they don't still exist, but because the context around them has been so transformed that they themselves no longer have any meaning.
Now, what do you call a landmark? Because you can define it by law for us, at least in terms of New York City law.
The law defines it in much more pedestrian fashion than the dictionary as an improvement which is thought to have aesthetic, cultural, historical, or architectural interest. And it's been expanded in the law to include both bricks and mortar, that is buildings, groups of buildings, as we discussed in the historic district, also interiors of buildings, and also scenic landmarks, so great works of landscape architecture,
For example?
like Central Park or Prospect Park, which many New Yorkers imagined, to digress for a minute, to be the way New York used to look. But they're really very conscious works of art, worked out in this case by Olmsted and Vaux, with each area of the shore, let's say the low water, or each location for planting, let's say on the Long Meadow and Prospect Park, being worked out as carefully as the location of a column on the surface of Grand Central Station. I wanted to say one thing about the word landmark, that it's frequently used and unfortunately used as a verb, as to landmark something, or was landmarked on October 31st.
You designate.
All one can do, and I think what Hugh's talking about at the time, is to recognize the qualities that make one a landmark, and you cannot confer that. Neither the Landmarks Commission nor the dictionary can make something a landmark which isn't.
Perhaps we should take a moment and explain briefly who decides and on what basis that these 500 buildings, these 34 districts, these nearly 14,000 properties have been designated as either landmarks or historic districts. Who decides and on what basis, by what standards and what values?
Okay, well, WHO is a commission of 11 citizens, some of whom are professionals, that is to say architects, landscape architects, architectural historians, and some of whom are laymen, purposely scattered in New York throughout the 5 boroughs. So
geographically, that
yes,
is.
There's a layman from Manhattan, which I have the honor to be at the moment, and a layman from the Bronx, and there's also a real estate expert, somebody to both watch out for the interests of the real estate community, but also to see that the commission makes appropriate designations. There's a professional staff which researches prospective nominations. Nominations come from the staff, from other agencies of the city government, and from the public at large. And frequently people write in and say, won't you please come out and take a look at our building and see whether or not you think ultimately it could be designated. Finally, if the commission decides it's worth having a public hearing, if the research seems to justify it, a hearing is held, and further discussion and research goes on, and then the commission may act to designate it. If the commission designates it, it in fact justifies its decision on aesthetic, cultural, historical, or architectural grounds, and sends it on to the Board of Estimate, where the Board of Estimate, being the all elected officials, the 5 borough presidents and the mayor and the controller, can affirm or fail to affirm the designation.
Let's translate that into human terms and ask an architect, a distinguished architect, who appeared before the Landmarks Commission in a now celebrated instance. But before we talk about that specific case, it seems to me that we should set place and neighborhood. Originally, there were individual designations, either by conscious effort, philosophical commitment. There are more and more historic districts. Do you see historic districts as the wave of the future? Do you consider that a more effective way to deal with the city rather than individual designations, Hugh?
You cannot apply a generality about this. Clearly, there are neighborhoods which are so cohesive and successful as sociological units that they qualify for designation. And it's interesting to see how there has been a contest of wills as to whether it was good or bad financially for a neighborhood to be designated a landmark.
Is it good or is it bad, or
It
does it
has,
depend
on the
upon...
whole, been extraordinarily good because it has stabilized the neighborhood and property values have risen. There was initially criticism of such an idea by people not who lived in the neighborhood but who had investments in the neighborhood, that their wealth was somehow being limited and denied the opportunity for development. There was somehow represented a taking. But on the whole, without question, neighborhoods which have achieved landmark status have responded economically. And the Jane Jacobs theories about living in the city and five-story buildings and so forth, certainly what's gone on in the areas of the city that I'm familiar with, are spectacular economically.
There are other ways, of course, and important ways that the phenomena has to be measured. In social terms, by and large, as well as financial terms, it's also been a very positive force for the city. Obviously, to make something better, to improve a neighborhood, to give the people who live there something to be proud of. Really, they've given it to themselves, but to recognize it in designation is valuable. The thing that concerns me, and I think concerns many who in the landmarks preservation movement, is the worry of gentrification. That if you designate an area, do you in effect
Let's take that again more slowly. The word, and the new word, and it has English origins.
Gentrification.
Is gentrification. What does that mean, and how does that affect?
As it is applied, as I understand it in the United Kingdom, it means making middle class or upper middle class something which was previously not so. To apply it in New York City, to take a neighborhood with handsome row houses that's occupied by low income people, and by making the houses attractive through the process of landmark designation, or really
Or
underscoring.
often long-term residents, so that it's not only the poor but often the elderly.
That's right. The poor, the elderly, those that are occupying space under what you might consider to be highly impacted and dense circumstances are vulnerable. Frequently, houses are owned by absentee landlords, delighted to sell to a nice young couple that could have instead gone to live in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's good for us in New York that they want to live in New York City and not Greenwich, Connecticut. It's inevitably bad for the family of six that was occupying the brownstone. There is an answer to this dilemma, it seems to me, and what we must do as a city and as a country is to be able to provide the financing, the mortgage financing and the insurance and the rehabilitation financing, so that stable families can remain in stable neighborhoods.
Now, how does the Landmarks Commission help with all of this? Is there, not only do we all believe in altruism, I suspect we all believe in palatable altruism. How does the Landmarks Commission make this all possible? Is there any way that they can assist?
We're looking for ways to assist. Part of it, first of all, there are precious few programs in this country that are addressed at this problem. There are precious few programs, despite the fact that in fact, what we've been describing, I think, Hugh, is the private market. Those people who have capital, what do they choose to do? They have chosen, time and time again in recent years, to come back to the center city, to redo a brownstone, to take over a loft building. Government programs, however, have failed to acknowledge that. Only recently has rehabilitation surfaced as an interest in HUD. Only recently has preservation surfaced as an interest in the housing agencies of the city.
Do you think the Tax Reform Act of 1976 will make a difference?
I think it's a help. The accelerated depreciation that you can get for preserving the building rather than tearing it down is a help. But I think we need much more than that to combat the problem we were discussing, gentrification. We need to have loans available to people to fix up their own houses.
I think Kent's quite accurate, because there's been a spectacular increase in the conversion of loft buildings for a fairly moneyed middle class, which has been very profitable to the people who own the buildings. And there has been this influx of middle class capital into brownstoning. But the people who live in those neighborhoods, given access to mortgage financing, surely themselves would do work if they were allowed.
Well, we do have sweat equity programs, and we have also, though, another aspect of this that may touch very, very soon on an historic district in New York. I'm thinking of the South Street Seaport, a district that, with all of its splendors, also has a kind of sleazy charm. Word is that the same development group that has changed Faneuil Marketplace into the country's largest tourist attraction is about to transform the South Street Seaport, thereby gentrifying that neighborhood, displacing many of the artists who have lived there and made it as attractive, the poor, the elderly, the marginal in other ways. How will you deal with that?
Well, some of it is inevitable. I, as you may or may not know, I was attached to the South Street Seaport for some years and a member of its board of directors, and I used to be very worried, and still am, about what would happen when finally either artists or chic shops, because they're not terribly far apart in class terms, got there.
Oh, yes, they are.
People living there would ultimately begin to protest the dead fish on the street, and once you got the dead fish in the street cleaned up and rid of that smell, then those great gulls that hang in the cornices of all the buildings would disappear. They'd go eat elsewhere. And ultimately, if you weren't careful, you'd lose the very qualities that you set out to protect in the first place. Let me say that neither the landmarks preservation law in New York City or any other law around the country is comprehensive enough. Our society is not used to approaching those questions comprehensively. And maybe we can't. Maybe it's beyond us to try to regulate change to the degree, and maybe it's wrong to try to create artificial environments. It is troubling. It's very troubling. There's this poignant film on the Faneuil Market showing the old men in the market slicing up sides of beef and whatnot, and then to go there today, and it is indeed wonderful, and it's a nice job architecturally, and it's a wonderful job in terms of tax revenue for downtown Boston. But
are you saying that preservation, renovation, recycling, adaptive use, retrofitting, call it what you will, is now too sophisticated a task to be left only to the well-intentioned and the well-intended? Well, is there a new blend, do you think, that must start? I mean, let me preface it by saying that Hugh Hardy is probably the man responsible for some of the most inspired and innovative adaptive reuses in the country, from one end of the country to the other, from Oregon to Texas to North Carolina to, I guess, one of New York's most recent delights, and that is the recycling of the Carnegie Mansion to the Cooper Hewitt Museum, by way of example. So with that preface, would you respond?
I think those are legitimately different words, and I think there is a difference between preservation, which implies the idea of keeping something in place in time, and reuse and recycling, and they're all nuances. Your question being, has it become so subtle that it has to be dealt with by experts? I think the answer is no. The reason that the experts are now confronting all this is the public forced the experts to pay attention. The experts were all off, at least in my field of architecture, building brand new buildings on the assumption that anything that was new was better than something old. In reaction to that, preservation was established, and it's a proper word. The 50s and the 60s were so gung-ho about destruction that, as
we called it urban renewal.
It was, yes. But it was a form of destruction.
It was indeed.
In the best and the most optimistic of American ideals, but nonetheless it was wholesale destruction. And in reaction to that, something called preservation, on the assumption that it would be very little of it when all this started. The movement, if that's the proper word, really seemed to have not the upper hand. The thing is reversed, and it's not a question of preservation alone. It's much more exciting than that. And in true preservation, it's not possible unless one could preserve the people as well.
Well, so that you're saying we must think in larger terms, and both of you have used during the course of this conversation a word called context. It seems to me that it is fairly widespread now, the belief that it is a good and a desirable thing for social, for economic, for historical values to preserve the past without jeopardizing the future. But it seems to me, too, that now that we have broadened the base of interest and constituency, we look for something else, and to my mind, there are two things that we look for. One is the quest for quality, and two, that not only context, but larger context. Would both of you comment on what I'm saying?
Well, I will, but it may not satisfy what you're asking, because what I think the value of all this has been, to go back to the seaport, which is an easy example, There were two things that marked the 50s and 60s in this country. One was this sort of wholesale destruction of things in the hope that that would lead clearing the stage for some grander life. And the other was a pervasive feeling of impotence among human beings who felt that, well, yes, they didn't really like what was happening, but it was in the hands of experts. This, as I say, was pervasive. We believed that the State Department knew more about affairs in Southeast Asia than humble beings like ourselves could. Certainly city planners knew more about cities. And I think one thing that's happened is that we have a little bit more confidence in our own instincts. And I think that the seaport, which was extraordinary, when it didn't have any money and didn't have any political support, it had interest from all kinds of people. I used to say that it was so pervasive that both Bill Buckley and Pete Seeger could tie their ships up there, and they could. And radical students from Columbia and really near-fascist retired admirals from Staten Island could somehow, they found something in common there. And what they found was themselves. And frequently, when we're talking about the process of redoing a brownstone or rediscovering a section of the city or redoing a loft or simply dusting off an institution that hasn't been lively for a while, we're enfranchising ourselves. And what could be better? What future could be more important than to end up with a group of people who had some sense of their own place, their own sense of their own place of possibility, and ultimately their own purpose?
Let's get back to the specific case and context that we alluded to before. Greenwich Village is an historic district. What is the jurisdiction that the Landmarks Commission has about either new construction or alteration to the facades of commercial and residential structures contained within that historic district? What's the process? Let's set the stage for the audience, and then we'll have the actor tell us what occurred.
An architect or an owner wishing to alter the facade of his building or demolish a building and erect another makes a presentation to the commission, first at the staff level and then finally at a public meeting of the commission, and shows visually what he means to do in terms of renovating a structure or replacing a structure or building a new structure on a vacant piece of land. It was, I think, that context that
that is what we're leading up to.
Innocently enough, with bright eyes and a bushy tail.
In no other context, perhaps, the role of a citizen activist has been more effective than in landmarks legislation. And I dare say that the Greenwich Village Historic District is one of the largest and the most active and the most enlightened. And then we have Hugh Hardy, architect, representing clients in what has become an historic and controversial piece of land. Can you tell us briefly what the circumstances were, its perhaps a bit about its genesis, its evolution, and its current state?
Well, it's an atypical problem because the origin was that the house was blown up by a series of subterranean political endeavors. They were making bombs in the basement, and the kids blew themselves up. And the house itself was demolished, and almost the building next door, and there was nothing there. It was clear that the house should be replaced. But how? Should it be replaced as the house was
Perhaps
in 1840?
Perhaps you should describe the block that it is a part of.
The block was remarkably uniform. At least these 5 houses in a row built in the 1840s were all of a Greek Revival period. Were very handsome houses. Of course, 1840 was before the Emancipation Proclamation, so that the basements where the slaves used to work have been somewhat altered. And in the course of time, various ideas about style have been ladled over the facades so that one got sort of Georgianized. Another had a 20s edition of a whole other story put on top, and so forth, because in the period of more than 100 years, naturally they've all become a little bit different. Now, if one is to engage in a restoration, the immediate question is restoring to when? If one restored it to the original house, it would not fit with the neighbors because they were all changed. If one restored it to what had been before it blew up, that house itself had been changed and again had been gentrified by making it look more like a house in England, because the people who lived in those houses liked them because they reminded them of England and they anglicized them. Or should it be an interpretation? What should it be? It was a remarkably visible project because of the circumstances, and highly unusual because it was not a neighborhood in decay. It was not something that had fallen down and was missing. And what we did was,
How did you
of course,
solve the problem?
we made everybody angry because we said it should be a mix of traditional elements and contemporary ideas, that was the appropriate solution in this case. So the preservationists were angry because we did not, in the limited preservationists were angry, we did not make a reproduction. The contemporary architects were outraged because we made, from their point of view, elements which were scenery, and we were criticized both ways. In fact, of course, it was approved and is being built, and I think is the appropriate knitting together of dissimilar elements. It is not necessarily, however, a precedent for future construction in Greenwich Village, because one presumes that there are not going to be similar occasions where a house blows up and has to be replaced.
It is terra incognita, though, and just to add a fillip to this story, I've been on the commission since...
F-I-L.
F-I-L-L-I-P. I've been on the commission since March, and early in my tenure as a commissioner, in one session we were presented with a totally made-up late 18th century house which someone wanted to erect in the west part of Greenwich Village, and really what began as sort of a very contemporary beach house-like structure for Columbia Heights in Brooklyn Heights. And so how could one commission, acting coherently, approve anything like those two designs? And of course, ultimately, the feeling is that since we are not designing people's property, but merely trying to see that they're as harmonious and honest as possible, we ended up really approving what amounted to a fake building in the West Village and a contemporary building in a very historic neighborhood in Brooklyn Heights, making everybody just as angry at us as they were at you.
One last very brief question. We can't save, we can't recycle the whole city. Where does this all lead? What is the future of landmarks, preservation, recycling? Where does it all lead? Hugh, a brief reply, and then Kent, please.
I think it's essential to recognize that new construction is just as valuable as preservation, and that what cities are about is this uncommonly unwieldy mix of the past, which is the built world, and the present, and the future, which is opportunity. You cannot preserve New York under a dome or in any kind of plastic wrapping.
Even if you wanted to. New York didn't get to be a great place by standing still. And its energy is its ability to change, and its hope is our intelligence to change it as best we can, saving the best in every period and building the best as we can for the future.
Well, special thanks to two master builders in their own right, Kent Barwick, chairman of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, Hugh Hardy, architect and member of Hardy, Holtzman and Pfeiffer. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and thank you, audience, for being with us too.